The dim light of the morning filtered through the high windows of the courtroom, golden rays softly sweeping over the cold marble floor. The courtroom was filled with stillness, broken only by the sound of shoes clicking against the stone and the rustling of papers being flipped through by lawyers, clerks, and police officers. The atmosphere was tense and solemn, as if each step could alter the fate of someone in the room. Courtroom 4, where this trial was taking place, was not a place of warmth or friendliness. The hard wooden benches were arranged in long rows. Everyone sat in silence, their eyes distant, not daring to speak. All attention was focused on every word, every testimony that would be presented. Lena Morgan sat alone in the front row, with only one empty seat beside her, where her daughter Sophie should have been sitting quietly, holding her soft bunny toy. Sophie's wide eyes scanned the room, her pale skin catching the light of the morning as it reflected off her delicate figure, making her appear like a small shadow in the vast space. Though Lena tried to remain calm, she could not hide the anxiety in her gaze. She had been called to testify in a warehouse robbery case, where she would speak of an event she had only glimpsed through her kitchen window, a masked figure running hurriedly. Although Lena couldn't clearly identify the person, her testimony about the direction and time of the event was critical to the case. Outside of Lena's calm exterior, Sophie remained quietly seated, her eyes following everyone in the room. She had never felt this tension, yet her curiosity about the surroundings seemed unusually intense. The adults around her were absorbed in their tasks, but Sophie seemed to be searching for something that the others couldn't see. The door to the right of the courtroom creaked open, causing everyone to glance up. A group of police officers entered, all dressed in dark uniforms, their straight-backed forms exuding a sense of authority. Leading them was Officer Ethan Hayes, a seasoned officer known for his many years of service in the K-9 unit. He walked into the courtroom with a cold, unwavering gaze, his demeanor suggesting that he controlled the situation with ease. Behind him was Max, a large German Shepherd K-9, his stern expression and sharp eyes missing no movement in the room. Max trotted alongside Hayes with military precision, his ears perked and eyes fixed ahead, as if on a dangerous mission. The strength and authority that Max radiated only added to the tension in the courtroom. This dog was no ordinary pet. With his extensive training, Max had been Hayes's most trusted companion in life-threatening situations. In this courtroom, Max seemed to carry a larger mission, ready to protect and prove his unwavering loyalty to his handler. Lena glanced over at Sophie, worried that the heavy atmosphere in the room might affect her. But Sophie remained still, her eyes locked on Max, as if the German Shepherd was holding something immensely important. Each time Sophie's gaze fell on Max, a strange sensation filled the room, as if an inexplicable connection existed between the little girl and the dog. Sophie, still unaware of the significance of what was about to unfold, kept her eyes fixed on Max, as if silently communicating with him. The entire room remained in silence, with all eyes now on the small child seated beside her mother. It seemed like a normal scene, yet the silence in the room signified a change that no one could foresee. And then, Sophie suddenly stood up, causing everyone in the room to turn their attention to her. She raised her hand and pointed directly at Officer Hayes. The courtroom fell silent, as if time itself had stopped. No one knew how to react as Sophie spoke, her clear, innocent voice breaking the tension. "Bad man." Sophie's words echoed through the room, piercing the heavy silence. From deep within her chest, it seemed that Sophie had no idea how her words had stunned everyone present. The expressions on their faces reflected surprise, but Sophie was unfazed, as if she didn't understand why everyone was looking at her, pointing at the police officer in uniform. The courtroom seemed to snap to attention after Sophie's declaration. Eyes turned to her, filled with curiosity and confusion. What was happening? How did this child know something that no one else could see? The eyes surrounding Sophie, from the lawyers to the prosecutor, and even the judge sitting high on the bench, couldn't help but wonder about the meaning behind the child's unexpected words. Lena, trying to remain calm, felt a rising sense of dread. She bent down and reached for Sophie's hand, but the child kept pointing at Hayes, her gaze never leaving Max, standing by his side. "Sophie, what are you saying?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie looked up at her mother, her eyes clear and unshaken. She softly repeated her words that had left everyone in shock, this time in a smaller voice, but still crystal clear. "I saw him there. He's bad, in the dark place. And there was barking." The room fell into a heavy silence. The faint sounds of sighs from those around them felt like echoes in the air. Sophie's words weren't just the ramblings of a child. They seemed like a hidden truth. The people present, from the lawyers to the witnesses, felt something was amiss. But no one could explain why Sophie said what she did, and whether her words held any real significance. Was it just the innocent musings of a child? Or was there something deeper that Sophie had seen? And then, as if instinctively, all eyes shifted toward Officer Ethan Hayes. His eyes, usually cold and calm, now showed a flicker of unease. For a brief moment, a flash of concern crossed his face, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by his usual composure. He tried to maintain his calm, but no one in the room could fail to notice the brief uncertainty in his gaze. Lena looked at Hayes, feeling as if all the questions she had never dared to voice were now being answered, even if indirectly. What Sophie had said wasn't a coincidence. The little girl had definitely seen something. But what? And why was it only her who could see it? Every new question only made things more complex, and the tension in the room grew even thicker. Meanwhile, Max, Hayes's canine dog, stood silently by his side, showing no unusual reaction. The dog stood tall, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a calm demeanor, as though nothing could disrupt his composed state. Yet, strangely, Sophie continued to gaze at Max, her eyes bright as if the dog held a secret, something only she and Max knew. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom were fixed on Sophie, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from Max, even though she knew her stare had caused the room to fall into an eerie silence. The strange tension in the courtroom was palpable. The witnesses and lawyers sitting near each other whispered and exchanged glances, trying to comprehend the meaning behind the little girl's words. Why would a child point out a man she had never met before? And why did Sophie insist that Hayes was the one who found her when she was kidnapped and locked in a storage room? These questions began to swirl in the minds of everyone present in the courtroom, and despite the doubt, no one dared to speak out and clarify the truth. Sophie's words couldn't be easily ignored, yet they were also too difficult to trust. How could a 3-year-old know such details? Could she be just imagining a story without fully understanding its significance? Lena, Sophie's mother, noticed the stares of the witnesses and the courtroom attendees turning toward her and Sophie, and she could feel the growing tension in the air. She tried to smile to reassure her daughter, but the anxiety in her heart felt like a fire, burning brighter by the second. "Sophie, can you sit still for a moment?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Yet Sophie remained, her gaze never leaving Max. The little girl didn't seem scared or worried. She simply felt that her small words had uncovered a truth that the adults couldn't see. "I saw him in the storage room," Sophie whispered again, her voice soft yet firm. "He's bad. He locked the door and I couldn't escape." Though Sophie didn't fully understand her words, in that moment it felt as if she was speaking a truth that someone needed to hear. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The entire room went quiet. Murmurs began to ripple through the air, but no one dared to speak. Questions began to form in the minds of everyone present. Could Sophie's testimony be the truth? How could this little girl possibly see what the adults couldn't? Judge Ellen Mathers, sitting at the bench, began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. She didn't look directly at Sophie or Hayes, but cast her gaze towards the lawyers, signaling them to continue the proceedings. But in that moment, doubts about Hayes's innocence began to take root in her mind. A child like Sophie couldn't have pointed at someone without reason. She felt a strange gust of suspicion, one she hadn't felt before. The lawyers seated opposite each other exchanged glances, clearly hesitant to make a scene. However, Prosecutor Michael Green, who had been following the case from the beginning, couldn't help but question the strangeness in Sophie's words. "We need to clarify this," he whispered to Hayes's defense attorney. "If this is true, it could completely change the course of the case." Hayes's defense lawyer, who had been confident throughout the trial, now showed clear signs of confusion in his eyes. He turned toward Hayes, who remained standing with a cold expression. But there was something in his demeanor that made people feel like he was hesitant, as if he knew the growing suspicion surrounding him. A few other witnesses in the room also felt that something was off. A vague sense of unexplained events began to linger in their minds. Those who had witnessed Sophie and Hayes throughout the trial started noticing strange details, but no one dared to speak out, as they didn't have enough evidence to confirm anything. Sophie, meanwhile, continued to look at Max, her eyes gleaming. She didn't know that she had just unleashed a wave of doubt that couldn't be silenced. All she wanted was to share what she believed was the truth, that Max, Hayes's loyal dog, was the only one who understood her. Sophie didn't realize that her innocent remark had just unraveled an entire web of crime, shaking everything the adults had considered normal. Detective Jonathan Clark sat in his office, holding a thick file, his expression grim. Each page seemed to present more questions than answers. He flipped through the reports of Officer Ethan Hayes, a man he had never paid much attention to before. Hayes was a veteran officer with years of service in the K-9 unit, but as Clark studied his files, something stood out, a distinct difference. The child abduction cases that Hayes had worked on always had one thing in common. He was the first to arrive at the scene. Each time, Hayes was praised for his quick detection and search abilities. But as Clark carefully examined each report, he noticed disturbing inconsistencies. The missing child reports were strangely vague. There were no clear signs of struggle, no warning of an intruder, just brief, incomplete reports. One report stated that a child had been found and was in good condition. However, witnesses claimed the child had visible bruises and appeared frightened. Yet Hayes' report made no mention of these signs. A question immediately arose in Clark's mind. Why was the report so lacking? Was Hayes hiding something? Clark continued to sift through Hayes's files, discovering at least 3 missing children cases over the past 5 years, where Hayes was the only one reporting and handling them. Each report had unsettling omissions. The children that Hayes had found in each case exhibited abnormal behaviors, such as fear or signs of abuse, yet these details were entirely absent from the official reports. Suspicion grew in Clark's mind. He knew something was amiss with these cases. A person like Officer Hayes, with his rank and responsibility in the police force, why would he allow such important reports to go missing? This only deepened Clark's doubts about Hayes's involvement in the disappearances, and possibly the dark actions he was concealing. Adding to this, Clark couldn't ignore Max, Hayes's K-9 partner. While Max was often praised as an outstanding police dog, Clark couldn't help but notice a shift in the dog's behavior whenever Hayes was near. Max no longer behaved like a normal canine. There was an underlying anxiety, tension in the dog's posture that Clark began to suspect was a sign of unspoken events. If Max could sense something, maybe there were secrets Hayes was hiding. Clark continued digging deeper, searching for clues that might explain the oddities. One particular report made him stop. One of the missing children cases involved a girl who was found in an abandoned warehouse, and Hayes had been the first on the scene. The police reported the child was unharmed, but the details in the report suggested that she had been locked in and unable to escape. Clark felt a strange connection between this case and the others. An abandoned warehouse, the place where Sophie had been kidnapped, the place where she had just mentioned for the first time in the courtroom. Sophie had seen Hayes there, and that's when everything started to come into focus. As Clark reviewed these details, a cold feeling began to rise within him. He realized that not only were the reports missing important information, but there was also a chilling truth that Hayes might be trying to conceal. The missing children, the forgotten abuse, all seemed to have an eerie connection to Hayes. These pieces of evidence began swirling in Clark's mind, forming a dark picture that he hadn't fully seen yet. But that was enough to make him sense that something was wrong behind the perfect facade of the veteran officer. Clark couldn't stop thinking about Max, Hayes' loyal canine partner. In the days that followed, when Clark interacted with Max, he noticed something strange in the dog's behavior. Max, a stellar dog in the canine unit, had always been composed, but every time Hayes came near, Max seemed uneasy, as if there was a faint fear in the dog's eyes. His ears would perk up, his body tense, and each step Hayes took seemed to make Max want to pull away. Clark had noticed these behaviors before, but hadn't dared to acknowledge them. However, as he looked more closely, he began to understand that this wasn't just a random occurrence or simple behavior from a police dog. It was a clear sign of abuse. Max, the loyal dog who had stood by Hayes' side all these years, now reacted to him as if he feared something would happen. From the worried glances to the unsteady steps near Hayes, Clark was forced to ask, could Max also be a victim in this story? He decided to have Max examined. One morning, after getting permission from Hayes, Clark took Max to a veterinarian who was experienced in evaluating canine dogs. The veterinarian, a trusted figure in the police community, had examined many canines throughout the years, but with Max, there was something wrong. As the vet checked Max, he discovered strange marks on the dog's body, old bruises, faded scars, and notably signs of damage caused by rough rope burns around Max's neck and legs. These marks indicated that Max had been chained and abused for an extended period, something Clark had never expected. He stood in stunned silence as he listened to the vet. "He's been chained for too long and likely beaten during training sessions," the vet said, his voice tinged with concern. "These injuries aren't accidental. These are signs of systematic abuse." Clark was shaken. He couldn't believe that Max, a loyal canine dog, had endured such pain and suffering while working with Hayes. Not only did this make him furious, but it also shed light on part of the dark picture he was trying to piece together. The injuries on Max weren't just evidence of abuse. They could be the key to unraveling the entire truth behind Hayes' actions. Detective Jonathan Clark made a decisive decision to uncover the truth, believing that Max could be a silent witness to the case. Max, a brave dog, not only worked alongside Hayes but had witnessed the wrongful acts Hayes had carried out. Clark felt a connection between Max and the missing children, the cases that Hayes had been involved in. Max may not have been able to speak the truth, but he certainly had felt the abnormalities in Hayes' actions. At this moment, Clark had found a crucial piece of evidence. Max's anxiety whenever Hayes approached was no accident. This dog knew something that he couldn't verbalize, and that realization led Clark to believe that Max wasn't just a regular canine dog, Max was the silent witness, the living proof of the wrongdoings Hayes had been hiding for years. The signs of abuse on Max's body, the abnormal behaviors displayed by the dog when near Hayes, everything seemed to be leading Clark into a labyrinth he had yet to solve. With each clue he uncovered, Clark felt the mounting instability of the case. Then, one night, after hours of intense work, Clark sat alone in his office, staring at his notes. A feeling of unease crept up inside him, as he couldn't stop thinking about Sophie and what she had said in the courtroom. Sophie's words, which had seemed so innocent and meaningless, now carried a weight that couldn't be denied. The girl hadn't simply pointed at Hayes. She spoke of a dark place, of barking, and of Max. The next day, when Clark met Sophie and Lena, he decided to challenge the girl's memory again. But this time, he wouldn't just ask simple questions. He would help Sophie unlock the buried memories in her mind. He believed that if he could extract the important details, they might provide answers to questions he had been unable to answer before. Sophie sat there, her large, bright eyes still fixed on him, clutching her soft, stuffed rabbit as though it was the only friend she could confide in. Lena sat next to her daughter, still worried, but offering quiet encouragement. Clark gently asked Sophie, "Can you remember any more details about where you were locked up?" Sophie looked at Clark, her gaze suddenly puzzled, as though she was hitting invisible walls inside her mind. "I remember," Sophie whispered. "I remember it was very dark. It smelled like metal, cold, and there was barking, Max's barking. But I don't remember who kidnapped me." Clark felt a lump form in his throat as he heard Sophie's words. He wasn't sure if this was a real memory or just fragments of what she had gone through. But one thing was certain. Max had been there, with Hayes, and what Sophie remembered couldn't be coincidence. "Can you remember anything else?" Clark gently asked, prompting Sophie's curiosity. Sophie paused for a moment, then continued. "I remember a man, but I don't know who he is. I just remember he didn't say anything. He just did his work." Sophie's response sent a chill down Clark's spine. A man doing his work. But who could that be other than Hayes? Why would Sophie remember these details if they weren't the truth? And if so, had Hayes kept her locked up in that warehouse? Clark began to look back at the old reports Hayes had submitted for the missing child cases, and one thing became clear. Hayes wasn't just casually involved in the search efforts. He had a closer connection to the missing children. Clark immediately returned to the investigation files. He started organizing the reports of the disappearances Hayes had been involved in. There was one clear common factor in these cases. Hayes was always the first to arrive when the children were found. But in Hayes's reports, there were always critical details missing about the state of the children when they were found. No injuries, no signs of resistance or abuse. It was strange. This only deepened Clark's suspicions. He had known there was something dark behind these cases. But now, with Sophie's testimony and her recollection of the warehouse, he felt that he had found a key point. A cold, metal-smelling warehouse where Hayes had been, where he had hidden the children he couldn't face the truth about. With each detail restored from Sophie's memory, Clark felt his suspicions being further solidified. Max, Hayes's loyal canine dog, was the silent witness. He was the living proof of the secrets Hayes had been hiding. Or rather, Max was the first to recognize the abnormality in Hayes's actions. In the moments that followed, Clark knew he had to act fast. He began gathering new evidence, searching for any clue that could bring the truth to light. Every step he took, every discovery he made, brought him closer to understanding the truth behind all the missing children cases Hayes had been involved in. And in his heart, one thing became increasingly clear. Hayes wasn't just the one causing harm to the children. He was the mastermind behind this entire scheme, hiding the truth for years. At that moment, all of Clark's focus shifted to the courtroom, where every doubt was now being tested. As Sophie continued to point at Hayes, the little girl suddenly exclaimed, "He's the bad man!" Her voice cut through the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, piercing the silence and drawing everyone's attention. Sophie's simple, innocent words sent a shockwave through the room. The eyes of the prosecutor, the lawyers, and the judge all turned toward her. Her testimony, brief as it was, cast a heavy shadow of doubt on Hayes, making the already charged air in the courtroom even more suffocating and tense. Hayes, from his spot, did not change his expression. His gaze remained as cold as stone. But there was something in his demeanor that caught everyone's attention. As a seasoned officer, Hayes was usually composed, rarely showing any emotion. Yet, this time, no one could ignore the slight flicker of unease in his eyes as they met Sophie's. He tried to maintain his calm, but the anxiety creeping within him was becoming more apparent. Judge Ellen Mathers, observing from the bench, her face expressionless, could feel the wave of doubt growing within her. She turned toward the prosecutor, Michael Green, signaling for him to continue. But in that moment, she couldn't help but wonder, was Sophie just an innocent child, or did she know something the adults couldn't see? Sophie's pointing continued, unrelenting. "I saw him. He's the bad man. He locked me in," Sophie said, her words making the tension in the courtroom even heavier. Lena, Sophie's mother, stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what she was hearing. Did the little girl truly see something? Or was this just the imagination of a child? Yet, Sophie's words were too clear to be ignored, with no ambiguity in them. A heavy silence hung in the air as the room remained still, only the quiet rustling of paper from the lawyers breaking the stillness. An uneasy feeling spread across the room. Everyone began exchanging glances, but no one dared to speak. Though Sophie's words were clear, could they really trust the words of a 3-year-old? Hayes remained still, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked on Sophie. His calm demeanor could mean many things, but it could also be a facade. Clark, standing off to the side, began to feel something deeply unusual. Someone like Hayes couldn't be innocent in this case. What was he doing here? And if Sophie's words were true, what really happened to the little girl in that storage unit? Time seemed to slow as another second ticked by, then another, the tension rising. Lena bent down, whispering to Sophie, but the little girl merely shook her head and added, "He was there, in the storage. He locked the door and wouldn't let me out." Her words hit like a sharp blow to the calm of the room. No one could ignore the certainty in her voice. Was this the truth? Prosecutor Michael Green stood up, taking a piece of paper from his desk and walking towards the judge. The atmosphere in the room thickened with tension. "We need a deeper investigation into the child's testimony," he said, his eyes fixed on the judge. "If Sophie's words are true, we are facing something very serious." Judge Mathers nodded, then looked at Hayes, her gaze sharper than ever. "Officer Hayes, do you have anything to say about this testimony?" All eyes in the room were now on Hayes. He could no longer maintain the calm he usually exhibited. The moments ahead would force him to face a truth that he could no longer deny. Contrary to the confident, cold demeanor he had always shown, the unease in Hayes's eyes was now impossible to overlook. Just for a moment, but it was enough to expose his growing anxiety. Hayes took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists, before he lowered his head slightly. It seemed as if he was searching for a reasonable explanation, something to dismiss Sophie's accusations, but her words had cut deep into his calm. He couldn't deny his presence in the cases Sophie pointed out, nor could he refute the connection between her testimony and the evidence Clark was gathering. Everything in the courtroom seemed to come to a halt, Each second felt heavier, the silence suffocating. As Hayes remained motionless, something strange happened. Max, the canine dog who had been standing by Hayes all this time, suddenly turned his head, staring intently at Sophie. The look in Max's eyes was not just concern, it was determination. It was as if the dog understood everything that was unfolding and was ready to do something to protect the little girl. Max began to move. His steps were strong and sure, as if he had made a decision. At first, no one understood his actions, but as Hayes started to move closer to Sophie, Max, with a stern and determined expression, suddenly stood between Hayes and the little girl, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. The atmosphere in the courtroom had grown more tense than ever. Max, without barking or growling, stood still, his presence radiating courage and turning the entire room heavy with anticipation. Everyone in the courtroom felt the change in the air, a tension that couldn't be easily explained. No one dared to move. Everyone just stood frozen, unsure of what Max would do next. Sophie, still seated, had her gaze fixed on Max. The little girl, unaware that the dog was standing guard over her, did not feel afraid or confused. In her heart, Max was a trusted friend. She knew he would always protect her no matter what happened. Hayes stopped. He looked at Max, his eyes showing a hint of worry, but no sign of fear. Hayes had grown accustomed to Max's loyalty and strength, but today he could not deny that the dog's presence had shifted. Max was no longer just a canine dog that Hayes controlled. Now he stood between Hayes and Sophie, like a shield, a symbol of unconditional loyalty that no one could ignore. Judge Ellen Mathers, watching the scene unfold from her position, began to feel the tension more acutely. She had witnessed tense situations in her courtroom before, but never one this heavy. Max wasn't just an ordinary canine. He was a silent witness to the irregularities surrounding Hayes. Lena, sitting next to Sophie, felt her own anxiety rising. She had never seen Sophie act like this before. Every time Max came closer, Sophie would remain still, her eyes locked on the dog as if there was some special understanding between them. Lena began to realize that her daughter wasn't just fixated on Hayes' presence. It seemed like Sophie knew something Lena couldn't comprehend. Max stood firm, unmoving, his eyes locked on Hayes. Though no sounds came from him, the protection Max displayed was clear. His movements, his posture, all indicated that the dog wasn't just guarding Sophie, but also signaling a critical shift in the unfolding story that everyone in the courtroom couldn't ignore. Clark, standing at the back of the room, saw the scene and realized that this might be the turning point he'd been waiting for. He watched Max, then Hayes, keeping his eyes fixed on both the man and the dog. Max could be the living evidence, and with the protective stance Max had taken toward Sophie here in the courtroom, the dog had made it abundantly clear his loyalty and bravery. Clark knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Max knew something Hayes was trying to hide, and now the dog was starting to speak the truth without words. Max remained standing in the middle of the courtroom, acting as a barrier between Sophie and Hayes. But what was surprising was that Max was not just any ordinary guard dog. He had become a living witness, a creature capable of sensing things others could not see. While Hayes stood motionless, his eyes betraying a subtle unease, for the first time during this trial, Hayes appeared to be losing his composure. The usual calm, collected demeanor was slipping. He glanced at Max, then Sophie, but there was no longer any confidence in his gaze. Max continued to track Hayes' every move, his eyes never leaving him. His body was tense, like a taut string, ready to react to the slightest wrong move from Hayes. Max had always been a reliable canine dog, never showing emotion or anxiety. But today, something had changed. Max could no longer conceal the fear. Clark could feel it, and it reminded him of the animals that had been abused. those that had lived through dark and painful experiences. Max was reacting on instinct. He sensed something deeply wrong, and it was connected to Hayes. Lena, sitting next to Sophie, could feel the rising tension in the room. Sophie remained silent, but Lena could sense the tension growing around them. Sophie wasn't scared, her eyes still glued to Max as if the dog was sending her a protective signal. Lena saw this, and in that moment she realized that Sophie and Max shared something more than just a typical pet-owner relationship. They seemed to have a special understanding, a silent communication that only those truly bonded could feel. Clark moved closer, his gaze fixed on Max. He recalled his previous interactions with the dog, how Max had always exhibited professionalism and calm. But today, with the shift in the dog's behavior, Clark started to believe that Max could hold the key to unlocking the major questions he'd yet to answer. The feeling in him was becoming clearer. Max wasn't just a smart police dog. He had seen and felt something that the adults couldn't understand. With everything happening in the courtroom, Clark couldn't help but think that Max was a silent witness to Hayes' wrongdoings. Max didn't need words, didn't need direct evidence. His actions alone had sent a powerful message. Hayes was hiding the truth about what had happened to those children, and Max had seen it. Questions swirled in Clark's mind. Could Max be the invisible witness in this case? Could the dog have witnessed something Hayes couldn't escape? These questions twisted in his mind. But one thing was clear. Hayes wasn't just an ordinary police officer. He was an abuser of power, a man behind missing children and abuse that no one could have suspected. From Hayes' side, he remained still, but the unease rising inside him was impossible to conceal. His calm, once a thin veneer of control, was cracking. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a living witness, a silent guardian of the truth. And now, that dog was pointing out that things weren't as they appeared. Sophie, still sitting quietly, suddenly spoke. I remember now he locked me in. I couldn't get out, her eyes still bright, her hands clutching her stuffed bunny. Her words once again could not be ignored. Sophie wasn't just saying something random. She mentioned a storage, a place that Hayes couldn't deny his involvement in. Clark looked again at Max, then at Hayes. His eyes locked onto the man and the dog. He knew he was facing a truth that couldn't be hidden, and this time, he wouldn't let anything obscure the path to justice. Despite Hayes' efforts to maintain his calm demeanor, or Max's silent protection of Sophie, Clark couldn't ignore the clues that were gradually unfolding in his investigation. Every piece he discovered, each time he reviewed it, became clearer and more significant. From the start of the investigation, Clark had suspected that Hayes might be involved in the disappearances of the children, and with every report he read, that suspicion grew. The night before, while at the office, he decided to dig deeper into Hayes' past. He began to review the cases Hayes had worked on, searching for inconsistencies, any documents that might have been overlooked or intentionally hidden. Clark opened a thick file on his desk, his fingertips brushing over the aged papers, some of which had yellowed with time. These were old reports of missing children, cases that Hayes had been involved in. He was taken aback when he discovered something suspicious. In every one of these reports, Hayes was the first to arrive when the children were found. Yet there was a glaring lack of detail in his descriptions. Important details were omitted, like the actual condition of the children when they were found. This made Clark stop. A feeling that something was wrong started to rise in him. He continued flipping through the reports, searching for more clues. One case made him pause longer. It was an incident that happened 3 years ago, when an 8-year-old girl named Mia went missing. Hayes was the first to report finding her in an abandoned warehouse, but the details about the scene were vague. Hayes' report claimed Mia was lost, with no significant signs of harm, but when Clark checked another record, It revealed that the girl showed signs of being assaulted, with light bruising on her body. What was strange was that Hayes's report overlooked all these signs. It seemed like he had intentionally blurred these marks, offering no explanation as to why Mia had bruises. Hayes's reports always lacked important details. These omissions couldn't be a coincidence. Clark began to suspect that Hayes wasn't just an ordinary police officer. He might be hiding something dark. He kept turning the old pages, each report adding to his growing suspicion. Hayes was always the first to find the missing children, but in each case, the reports lacked crucial details about the victim's condition. And what worried Clark even more was that in all of Hayes's reports, there were common signs. The children seemed unharmed, with no signs of resistance and no notable injuries. But when Clark cross-checked with other witnesses, the children showed clear signs of abuse. Another troubling detail that Clark couldn't ignore was that these incidents weren't unusual for Hayes. They were eerily similar. In each case of a missing child, Hayes was always the one to find them. This only strengthened Clark's suspicion about Hayes's actions. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie's testimony in the courtroom, where she pointed at Hayes and said, "He's a bad man." Those words echoed like a loud clap of thunder, as though Sophie had seen something that the adults couldn't. Clark believed Sophie was right. Clark reviewed the documents again, starting to piece together the case. He began searching for more evidence related to Hayes and Max. Max, despite being a loyal canine, showed strange behavior. This dog not only displayed anxiety when near Hayes, but also reacted strongly in tense situations. Clark felt that Max wasn't just a tool in Hayes's job, but could be a crucial witness. He knew that if he could gain Max's trust and analyze these signs, he would uncover the truths Hayes had been hiding. The ambiguous reports, the missing details, and Max's behavior were undeniable clues. Clark felt that everything was gradually becoming clearer. He began to realize that Hayes wasn't just a police officer. He was someone with a dark agenda, concealing the truth behind the disappearances of the children. And Max might be the key to unlocking the truth. As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew unbearably tense. Hayes continued to deny all accusations. He stood there, his face cold and calm, as if Sophie's testimony and the evidence Clark had gathered were mere nonsense. Hayes, once known as a model officer, was now at the center of an investigation no one could have imagined. Sophie, still sitting quietly, continued to make statements that no one in the courtroom, not even the witnesses, could ignore. She looked at Hayes, her eyes bright and certain, then turned to Max, as if with the presence of the canine, she could recover a key piece of her memory. "He locked the door, and I couldn't get out," Sophie repeated what she remembered about the dark place she had been locked in. Her words struck like a blow to the air, making the atmosphere in the courtroom even heavier. Every word Sophie said was etched deeply in the minds of those listening. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the truth in her words. But at the same time, an incredible disbelief spread across the room. Could a 3-year-old really remember such specific details? Hayes, despite his efforts to maintain his composure, showed signs of wavering. He couldn't ignore the stares of everyone, the doubts that were growing in the room, even though he still kept up his calm demeanor. But deep down, he was probably beginning to question the events of the past. He couldn't deny Sophie's testimony, but he knew that if he didn't reject it now, he couldn't save his position. The courtroom seemed to fall into an unusual silence, not a single sound, only Sophie's words and the tense expressions of the people present. Max, standing next to Hayes, began to show signs of worry. He didn't bark, but his movements were unusually stiff. Max's eyes were locked on Sophie, and as Hayes started to walk closer, Max's body tensed, like a tightly stretched bowstring. A moment of tension passed through the air like a cold breeze. Max began to move, his steps firm, but it seemed the dog sensed something was wrong. Hayes stopped, but Max didn't. The dog positioned himself between Hayes and Sophie, lifting his head high, his ears pricked, and his sharp eyes never leaving Hayes. The courtroom held its breath again. Their eyes shifted from Sophie to Max, then back to Hayes. For the first time, a K-9 wasn't just an assistant in the courtroom, but a silent witness, embodying unconditional loyalty that everyone could feel. Clark stood at the back of the room, his eyes locked on Max, then back on Hayes. Every step Hayes took seemed harder now. Every movement from Max seemed to confirm something Hayes couldn't deny. Clark knew that if Max reacted this way, there must be a reason, and that reason wasn't coincidence. Judge Mathers also couldn't help but notice Max's actions. She realized that Max was showing a powerful protective stance towards Sophie, as though the dog knew her safety was at risk. She could feel the tension in the courtroom, and she began to take Sophie's testimony more seriously than ever before. Despite Hayes's efforts to maintain his calm demeanor, and Max standing silently, protecting Sophie, Clark knew that nothing Hayes could say would matter anymore. Max's actions had already spoken for everything. Clark began mentally noting every detail, preparing for the next steps in his investigation. He understood that what was unfolding in front of him was a pivotal moment, and Max was the only living proof he had. Max, with his sharp eyes and tense body, stood firm between Hayes and Sophie. This time, however, the dog wasn't just standing guard. The tension in Max's body grew more palpable. Suddenly, a low growl, powerful yet controlled, rumbled from his throat, making everyone in the courtroom jump. The sound from Max seemed like an undeniable signal of the instability in the relationship between the dog and his owner. Standing opposite Max, Hayes could clearly sense the shift in the dog's attitude. For the first time in all the years they had worked together, he no longer had control over Max. This dog, once obedient and loyal, had become a creature of protection, an entity Hayes could no longer command. Max was reacting purely on instinct, an instinct everyone in the room could feel. The dog was protecting Sophie, and no one could stop it. Clark couldn't tear his eyes away from Max. He saw the tension in the dog's body, the muscles twitching as Hayes took a step closer. Max slowly turned his face toward Hayes, and in that moment, Clark knew something monumental was about to happen. Max might not fully understand everything, but the dog knew Hayes was a threat, and protecting Sophie was the only duty he needed to fulfill. Hayes, at this moment, could no longer hide his anxiety. He stood frozen, arms crossed over his chest, but his eyes flickered between Max and Sophie. He knew that if Max took any further action, everything he had worked for would unravel. All the things Hayes had done over the years were now beginning to surface. But instead of stepping back, he moved forward toward Max. A challenge, it seemed, as if daring the dog to make the first move. The moment Hayes took another step toward Max, the dog lunged at him, swift as lightning. A roar rang out, strong and full of authority. Hayes didn't have time to react. Max approached quickly, eyes blazing like fire, jaws clenched tight. The dog did not attack, but the threat was unmistakable. Sophie, still sitting quietly, never took her eyes off Max, but she didn't feel afraid. She looked at Max with trust in her eyes. She knew Max would never hurt her, and the dog would protect her no matter what. It was as if an invisible bond existed between them, a silent communication that only a child and a loyal dog could share. Hayes finally realized his helplessness. He stood motionless, his eyes wide, too stunned to act. He was no longer in control of the situation in that courtroom. In that moment, all the truths he had been trying to hide for years began to unravel. Max was not just a police dog. He had become the guardian of the truth that Hayes could no longer deny. Judge Mathers, witnessing this turn of events, felt the tension in the air rise. She realized that things were no longer as they seemed. This was no longer just a routine trial. It was a battle between evil and justice, between lies and truth. Max, in his silent protection, had become the key witness, an essential figure in this case. Clark stood, watching, fully aware that things were finally starting to come to light. He knew that the next steps in the investigation would be crucial. Max had shown him the undeniable truth. The only remaining question was how much longer Hayes could continue living in his web of lies. Every clue, from the abnormal behavior of the canine to Sophie's trembling testimony, pointed to one undeniable truth. Hayes was not just another cop caught up in routine investigations. He was part of something much darker, a man cloaked in the illusion of duty, hiding behind a badge polished to perfection. Day by day, Clark felt the threads pulling tighter, drawing him toward a picture far more sinister than scattered incidents. He began reassembling old reports, combing through archived files, searching for overlaps between Hayes and the missing persons cases he had handled. The gaps weren't random. The omissions were too precise. Evidence overlooked, timelines blurred, and statements that once felt standard now rang with hollow certainty. The deeper Clark dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. There was Mia, an 8-year-old girl who had vanished 3 years ago. Hayes was the first to find her, hidden in an abandoned storage unit. But when Clark cross-checked witness reports, the cracks became glaring. Mia had bruises, scratches, signs of prolonged distress, yet in Hayes's report, none of it was mentioned. Not a word about the pain she had clearly endured. Not a line about the silence in her eyes. It wasn't negligence. It was deliberate. Clark widened his search, following Hayes through the ink trails of other disappearances. And then, the truth began to breathe. Low, cold, and cruel. The children Hayes rescued were never taken to hospitals. Some had visible injuries, some couldn't speak, but none were examined. None were seen by professionals. And that, to Clark, was no coincidence. This was method. This was a cover-up. And Hayes, he wasn't alone. As Clark peeled back more layers, he found names, officers linked to Hayes, men and women with clean records on paper but red flags buried deep, corruption allegations that never surfaced, internal investigations that evaporated without explanation, veteran cops who had partnered with Hayes, whose connections reached into the city's darkest corners, where the law bent for the right handshake or the right threat. But it wasn't just paperwork that spoke. It was Max, the K-9 unit, trained for discipline, trained to obey. And yet, whenever Hayes was near, Max would freeze. Not in fear, but in something deeper. A resistance that came from memory, from something seen and remembered. Clark had begun noticing it more and more. Max's flinches, his averted gaze, the shallow breaths, and once a low growl that stopped as soon as Hayes left the room. Max was trying to say something. The scars on Max's side weren't from the field. Clark had seen too many service dogs to mistake those for random injuries. These were deliberate, systematic. Clark began to believe the impossible, that Max had been a silent witness to something no human had dared speak aloud. And as he traced the connections, one realization came with chilling clarity. These cases, these missing children, they weren't isolated tragedies. They were pieces of a calculated chain. Each disappearance, each rescue by Hayes, formed a trail of manipulation, a network where victims weren't just harmed, they were erased, rewritten, folded into stories that never got told. And standing in the middle of it all was a man trusted by the system. But now Clark had something Hayes didn't expect: a dog. A living, breathing testament. And Max, in his silence, held a truth no lie could suppress. Clark realized he could no longer let Hayes hide behind his lies. The truth was ready to come to light, and Max was the silent witness that could help reveal everything. What Clark had uncovered was now undeniable. Hayes was not just a police officer, but part of a criminal network. And he would have to answer for what he had done. The truth could no longer be buried, and every step Clark took now was aimed at exposing the man behind the mask. The next morning, Clark walked into his office. Stacks of case files covered his desk. He opened one report he hadn't had time to read carefully the night before. It was from an old missing child case Hayes had been involved in nearly 5 years ago. The file contained no clear signs that the child had been abused, even though other witnesses gave contradicting descriptions. Clark noticed Hayes's report was missing key details, like the exact time the child was found and Hayes's actions at the scene. Once again, something felt deliberately left out. Clark knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to find more evidence to confront Hayes directly. He met with other investigators in the department and asked them to help gather records. The inconsistencies in Hayes's reports couldn't be ignored, but Clark also understood that only solid, irrefutable evidence could bring Hayes out from the shadows. 1 week later, Clark received a crucial update. Surveillance footage from an abandoned area near the scene of one of the missing person cases had been recovered. The short video not only showed Hayes acting suspiciously, but also clearly revealed his connection to a criminal network in the city. In the footage, Hayes appeared alongside a man he had been seen with in previous cases. Clark suspected this man was also part of the criminal operation. The two were speaking privately, and Max was visible in the frame, standing nearby, yet not acting like a typical canine on duty. This footage became the clue Clark could no longer overlook. It not only confirmed Hayes's involvement with a criminal group, but also showed he had been using his job to conceal illegal activities. Clark felt a rising anger in his chest. He couldn't let Hayes continue to operate in the dark, and he wouldn't stop until the truth was fully exposed. Clark continued to chase other leads, determined to build the clearest case yet of Hayes's involvement. He requested that other investigators re-examine reports from missing child cases Hayes had worked on. New pieces of evidence began to surface: vague write-ups, lack of detail from witnesses, and traces of tampering in investigations. Everything pointed to Hayes being driven further into a dark corner he could no longer escape. Throughout the investigation, Max continued to show strange behavior every time Hayes was near. The dog didn't just react. He showed deep distress. Whenever Hayes appeared, Max showed signs that couldn't be explained: tension in his body, anxious eyes, unease that went beyond training. These actions, though wordless, became evidence Clark couldn't ignore. Max clearly sensed something about Hayes, and his reactions were part of the silent testimony Clark had been searching for. Meanwhile, Clark continued gathering information from other sources and discovered Hayes had worked with a transnational crime group, one he had ties to through previous cases. One of the survivors from a past disappearance began to speak out. She was just 7 years old at the time and had escaped from a warehouse where she had been kept locked up and forced to witness Hayes's actions. She described Hayes as the only person present when she was rescued. This only strengthened the suspicion that Hayes had done far more than simply fail his duty. He had helped orchestrate the crimes themselves. Clark knew he was on the verge of the truth. The evidence was no longer scattered or uncertain. It was forming a clear and irrefutable picture. Just one more step, and Hayes would finally be forced to face the crimes he had long buried. But Clark also understood that confronting someone like Hayes would never be simple. People like him knew how to manipulate the truth, how to protect themselves behind walls of silence and power. Still, Clark couldn't back down now, because Max, quiet, watchful Max, was the key to unlocking everything. When the final pieces were gathered, when every buried report had been unearthed and every lie dismantled, Clark brought it all forward. Hayes was arrested inside the courtroom, and in that moment, it wasn't just a legal victory. It was a triumph of loyalty. Max, the canine who once stood silent beside Hayes, had helped expose the truth he had tried so hard to hide. But even as the trial came to a close, Sophie and Max were still left to face the echoes of what had happened. Sophie, only 3 years old, had walked through a darkness no child should ever know. The memories of her abduction, the fear, the nights without answers, all remained etched in her mind. But when Hayes was taken away and the truth of his actions was revealed, Sophie no longer had to live in fear. Max had saved her. And his loyalty wasn't just protection, it was redemption. Months passed, and when the dust finally settled, Sophie and Max began a new life. Lena, Sophie's mother, chose to move somewhere far from the memories, far from the weight of what they had endured. They found a quiet home on the outskirts of town, away from sirens and noise. There, only the wind and sunlight kept them company, and it was all Sophie needed. Each morning, Sophie played with Max in the garden. They chased one another through the tall grass, laughter ringing like bells in the morning air. Her voice, once silent with trauma, now danced with joy. Max was no longer a K9 on duty. He was Sophie's guardian, her friend. He didn't have to wear a harness or follow commands anymore. He was free. And in that freedom he found healing. The scars on his body, the shadows behind his eyes, they slowly faded. He no longer lived under Hayes's control. He was no longer defined by fear. In the quiet closing scene, Sophie stood at the window, watching the late sun fall across the yard. Max lay peacefully beneath a tree, his fur glowing in the golden light. Sophie jumped down and ran to him. She knelt, gently resting her hand on his back, a gesture of thanks, a promise that she would never feel alone again. Max lifted his head. His eyes met hers. He didn't move, didn't bark, but his gaze held something deeper than words, a quiet comfort, unwavering and eternal. "Sophie," Lena called softly from inside. "Come here, sweetheart." Sophie smiled, turned toward the house, and waved at Max before stepping away. As she passed him, she reached out once more, resting her hand on his head. "Thank you, Max, for staying." Max didn't respond. He didn't need to. He lay still, content, surrounded by the peace he had helped create. Each day now passed gently. The nightmares were gone. The fear was gone. And Max, loyal, silent Max, had fulfilled his purpose. He had saved a child, and in doing so brought light back into her life. From the window, Lena stood watching them. Her heart overflowed with quiet gratitude. She knew now that her life, and Sophie's, had returned to a path of hope. The darkness hadn't disappeared completely, but the unconditional love and protection Max had given them had carried them through it. A soft smile touched her lips. Because even when the past was too heavy to forget, they had found light ahead. The story of Sophie and Max wasn't just a personal journey. It sounded a quiet alarm for something larger. The failings within a system meant to protect both children and animals. After Hayes was sentenced for his crimes, a new wave of questions emerged. People began to ask how K9 units were monitored and who was truly looking out for the animals in service. Michael Green, the prosecutor who had stood firmly throughout the trial, took up the cause. He began to call for serious reforms in how K9 units were managed across the country. Following the verdict, he partnered with animal rights advocates, child protection agencies, and government officials to launch a bold new initiative, one that would protect both the voiceless and the vulnerable. It was called the Sophie Max program. The program focused on improving oversight of canine police units. It introduced ethical screening and behavioral assessments for all handlers. It ensured that those working with service animals received proper training to identify and respond to signs of abuse. No more unchecked control. No more quiet suffering like what Max had endured. Clark was one of the first to join. After witnessing firsthand what Max had suffered under Hayes's command, he knew change was not only necessary, it was long overdue. He began working closely with animal welfare organizations, veterinarians, and behavioral specialists to develop new, humane training models for working dogs. The initiative also included close monitoring of all reports filed by canine officers, ensuring that every document related to detection, care, or protection of animals had to be transparent and subject to independent review. Any misconduct by police officers could now be flagged and dealt with immediately without being shielded by systems that once prioritized personal immunity over accountability. Meanwhile, Lena and Sophie received overwhelming support from the community after Hayes's conviction. They were given proper protection and access to trauma counseling, helping Sophie work through the haunting memories of her past. Though just a child, Sophie had played a vital role in uncovering the truth, and her story, along with Max's unwavering loyalty, inspired millions with a message of courage and unconditional love. Max, after being rescued from Hayes's control, began a new life in peace, alongside Sophie. No longer subjected to brutal training sessions or dangerous operations, Max became a symbol of loyalty and endurance, a trusted friend Sophie could rely on in any situation. The Sophie Max initiative quickly gained momentum, endorsed by law enforcement agencies and animal welfare organizations across the country. Several cities and police departments began adopting the program as a new standard for canine training and supervision. Clark, once just an investigator, became one of the most passionate advocates for animal welfare and child protection reforms. As news of the initiative spread, members of the public responded with heartfelt support. Media outlets ran features on Sophie and Max's journey, and images of the little girl hand in paw with her dog became symbols of justice and loyalty. They had not only exposed a hidden crime, but had also sparked a broader movement to protect vulnerable lives. Their story reminded thousands that heroes don't always wear uniforms or possess great power. Sometimes, a hero is a child holding the fur of a dog. Sometimes, it is a creature that listens, protects, and stays, even in silence. Despite the sudden wave of attention, life for Sophie and Max moved on, now free from fear and shadow. They left the city behind, settling into a small home in a peaceful suburb, far from the ghosts of the past. Lena had taken her daughter and Max to a place where memories no longer whispered through every hallway, a place where old scars could finally rest. Each morning, as sunlight crept through the windows, Sophie and Max would run out into the yard. Max was no longer the rigid canine trained for obedience. He was now a friend, a gentle presence by Sophie's side during moments of quiet happiness. She loved to chase him across the grass, her tiny feet kicking up joy as Max ran beside her, tail wagging, spirit light. Their laughter and movement filled the air with a music that only they could hear. One day, as Sophie sat under a tree sketching pictures, Max lay beside her, his eyes never drifting far from her face. Whenever she looked up, Max was already watching, as if standing guard over the world she was rebuilding. In his company, Sophie never felt alone. The fear that once shadowed her young life had vanished, replaced with safety she could feel in her bones. And the wounds inside her began to heal, not with time or medicine, but with the quiet gift of friendship. Lena, too, started to rediscover peace. She and Sophie would walk together in the park, and whenever they saw other dogs, Sophie would greet them with a smile. though her gaze always returned to Max. His loyalty had taught her something profound about love and protection. Max wasn't just the dog who saved her. He was a constant, a companion who would walk every next step of her journey. With Max's support, Sophie grew stronger each day. She no longer feared the dark, no longer woke up trembling. Max had helped her reclaim her joy, her confidence, and a sense of safety no one else could give. One afternoon, Sophie and Max sat together on the porch steps, looking out at the open sky. Sophie leaned in gently and whispered, "I'm not scared anymore, Max. Thank you for staying with me." Her voice was filled with warmth and gratitude. Max raised his head, eyes glowing softly in the amber dusk. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than any words. As night fell, Max curled up beside Sophie, the faithful guardian who never left her side. The past had faded. The fear had lifted. In its place stood a new beginning, one built on trust, on healing, and on the quiet bond between a girl and her dog. Their life had begun again, filled with hope and peace, where love and loyalty weren't just words, but the truth they had lived together. But for Clark, peace hadn't come for everyone just yet. The investigation he was leading was far from over, and the truth still lurked behind layers of thick, deliberate deceit. What had unfolded in court was only the beginning, a small crack in the wall of lies surrounding the case. Hayes might have been arrested, and his falsified reports exposed, but Clark couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister lay beneath the surface. From what he had uncovered so far, Clark knew Hayes wasn't just a rogue cop playing with power. He was a piece of something much bigger, a thread in a criminal network that, if left unexposed, would continue harming innocent children and voiceless animals. That was why Clark couldn't close the file just because Hayes had been convicted. He started re-examining all of Hayes' past reports on missing children. These weren't just random cases the officer had happened to be involved in. Clark suspected they were fragments of a much larger, darker scheme. Not only did Hayes have links to the missing children, but Clark began to believe the man had used his badge as a shield to conceal criminal acts. As Clark dug deeper, the puzzle began to shift. When he interviewed Hayes' former colleagues on the force, things got murkier. A few officers displayed questionable behavior. The way they closed ranks around Hayes, the same vague, templated language in their old case reports, it all reeked of complicity. Suddenly, it wasn't just about one bad cop. It looked more like an organized web inside the department, and Hayes, it seemed, wasn't acting alone. Driven by instinct and haunted by the faces of those missing kids, Clark expanded the scope of the investigation. He pulled old case files, combed through every missing child report Hayes had ever touched, and compared them to those involving other officers in the same unit. Patterns emerged. There were found children whose files described no signs of abuse, yet Clark tracked down witnesses who remembered clearly. Those kids were terrified. Something had happened. Something the official reports scrubbed clean. He dove deeper. Clark gathered every scrap of documentation he could from unresolved cases, especially ones where Hayes was first on the scene. He pored over vague reports, searching for inconsistencies, for silences that spoke louder than words. One case stood out. Liam, a 6-year-old boy who vanished 3 years ago and was found by Hayes, unconscious but alive. The official report was clean. Too clean. No injuries, no trauma, just a tired boy lost in the woods. But eyewitnesses told a different story. They remembered bruises. They remembered Liam screaming when strangers approached. Yet none of that was in Hayes' report. And the deeper Clark dug, the more he realized. This wasn't oversight. It was omission. Intentional. The picture forming in Clark's mind was more disturbing than anything he had imagined. He couldn't walk away now. He began assembling a team of trusted investigators, people who hadn't been part of the department's tainted history, to help him follow the evidence wherever it led. And what it uncovered was no longer just about missing children. It was about power, control, silence. And then there was Max, Hayes' canine partner. At first glance, Max seemed unremarkable, another German shepherd trained for police duty. But Clark couldn't ignore what he saw in the dog's behavior. Max had been with Hayes for years, and now, separated from his handler for the first time, the dog was unraveling. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. But his body held a tension Clark couldn't unsee. Max stared at Hayes with a mixture of dread and loyalty. And when Clark tried to approach him, the dog flinched. Something wasn't right. Clark took Max for a routine health check, or so he told the department. But what he needed was more than routine. He brought in a veterinarian, someone experienced in assessing trauma in animals, especially working dogs. The examination was slow, careful, quiet. Max didn't resist, but his silence spoke volumes. When the vet gently tilted Max's head to examine his neck, Clark saw it. Scars. Faint, nearly healed but unmistakable. Bruises hidden under thick fur. Lines that spoke of restraint, pressure, signs of a collar that had been pulled too tight for too long. The area around Max's neck looked like it had once been bound. Not for training, for control, or punishment. Max didn't fight the exam, but his trembling, his instinct to retreat, it all painted a picture that shook Clark to his core. This dog had lived in fear. And now, Clark realized, Max might be the only living witness left, the only one who had seen everything but couldn't speak. Still, Max carried the truth, in his scars, in his eyes, and Clark wasn't going to stop until someone listened. These scars weren't caused by an accident, the veterinarian said, voice low and grave. It looks like Max has endured long-term abuse. He's been chained for extended periods. And what concerns me most, there are clear signs of psychological trauma. Clark stood silent, stunned. His eyes fell on Max, the German shepherd once hailed as strong and fearless, now sitting quietly, gaze heavy and distant, as if the strength to resist had been drained from his body. There was something unspeakably sad in the way Max moved. Each step carried hesitation. Each breath seemed bound in invisible chains. This wasn't just a dog trained for obedience. This was a creature who had been broken, stripped of the right to flinch, to resist, to simply be. But the vet's next words struck even deeper. This dog wasn't just physically abused. He's been mentally conditioned. What we're seeing here isn't just trauma, it's programming. Max isn't free. He's been turned into something obedient by force, not by trust. Clark's gut twisted. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a silent witness, a soul imprisoned behind those amber eyes. Max couldn't speak, but his body told a story that words never could. And Clark, listening now not with ears but with intuition, understood the weight of that truth. This dog had seen everything. Max might be the only one who truly knew what happened between Hayes and the missing children. And Clark realized this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about giving voice to the voiceless. Max wasn't property, he was evidence. Clark made a decision. Max would become part of the investigation. Not just a retired canine, but the living thread that might unravel years of buried crimes. Every twitch, every flinch, every glance from Max would be treated as a clue. His pain was a compass, and Clark was ready to follow it. But while Clark continued pulling at threads in the dark, another battle was quietly unfolding, one inside the fragile heart of Sophie. The little girl had begun adjusting to a life where peace was possible, where sunlight came through windows instead of locked doors. But the scars on her mind ran deep, and no warm meal or clean bed could erase the past. Max had protected her, but the memories still lingered, like smoke from a fire long extinguished. With the help of gentle therapists, Sophie began opening up. At first it came in fragments, blurred images, muffled sounds, but over time, the fog started to lift. Her memories came in waves, sometimes crashing, sometimes soft. And always, Max was there, sitting beside her like a silent guardian, his eyes steady, his presence grounding her when the world tilted sideways. One afternoon, Sophie sat with a pen in hand, paper blank before her. The therapist asked her to draw what she remembered. She couldn't. Instead, she looked to Max, who rested by her feet like a statue of loyalty. She whispered, not to the adults in the room, but almost as if to Max himself. "It was dark," she said, voice barely audible. "I remember barking, Max's barking, but I don't remember the face of the man who took me." Her voice trembled, her fingers clenched the pen. But then, more came. Bit by bit, Sophie began to recall the metal smell of the storage room, the cold floor, the panic. And then, like a flash, a face, not clear, not vivid, but present. Hayes. She couldn't describe every detail, but she remembered how he stood, still, detached, cold. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak with warmth. He just watched, like it was routine. Like she wasn't a child, like she wasn't anything at all. When Clark heard Sophie's account, something inside him stirred, a kind of righteous fury that burned slow but hot. These weren't just the words of a child. They were puzzle pieces. They were the proof he needed to connect Hayes to something darker. Sophie's pain wasn't just trauma, it was testimony. Clark began to see Hayes differently, not just as a corrupt officer, but as a predator who had hidden behind a badge, a man who abused animals and manipulated cases of missing children, a man who was always first on the scene, who always wrote the reports, who always made sure nothing incriminating ever made it to the paperwork. Now that carefully built facade was cracking. With every word Sophie shared, the timeline became clearer. The storage room, the smell of rusted chains, the fear, the barking. Maximum. Max had been there, and Max had fought for her, silently, fiercely. Even now he stayed at her side like her shadow, the last piece of her nightmare that didn't make her afraid. The only presence that told her, deep down, "You're safe now." Clark listened to Sophie's trembling voice and watched Max's calm strength, and for the first time, he saw not just a child and a dog, but survivors, witnesses, warriors in their own quiet way, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge. He couldn't stop now. Every detail Sophie remembered, every tremor in Max's body, they were guiding him. The lies Hayes buried were being pulled into the light. And Max was no longer just a retired canine. He was the unspoken proof, the key to justice, the soul that could unravel everything. This wasn't just Sophie's story anymore, or Clark's, or Max's. It was the story of justice breaking through silence, one bark, one tear, one memory at a time. The next day, Clark sat quietly in his office, surrounded by neatly arranged files, every report, every investigative record from the missing child cases involving Hayes. He stared at the evidence he'd gathered, the inconsistencies in Hayes's reports, Max's silent testimony, and the tension from the courtroom the day before. He knew one thing with absolute clarity. This investigation couldn't stop now. He was closer to the truth than ever before. The trial resumed. But this time, it wasn't just about charges. It was about something more powerful. a direct confrontation between Sophie and Hayes. Inside the courtroom, Sophie sat beside her mother, her eyes fixed on Hayes with a quiet intensity. Under pressure from Hayes's defense attorneys, she held her ground and said again, firmly, "He's the bad man." The air turned sharp, nearly unbearable. A silence fell. All eyes were now on Sophie. Then they turned to Hayes. He sat there, face still, trying to maintain calm. But it was impossible to ignore the unease growing in the room. People began whispering. Was the girl telling the truth? Could her words be trusted? But Sophie's gaze didn't shift. Her tiny hands clenched a stuffed rabbit, her fingers steady. She pointed at Hayes, eyes glowing not with fear, but with truth. Then came a moment no one could have predicted. Clark, waiting outside the courtroom, could feel the pressure building. This wasn't just testimony. This was a reckoning. Sophie's voice, small but strong, was bringing it all to the surface. And that's when Clark saw what he hadn't before. Hayes wasn't just an abusive officer. He might be the orchestrator of something far worse, a hidden criminal network. He hadn't simply made mistakes. He might be behind it all. As the trial pushed on, Clark went back through case after case, every child Hayes claimed to have found. It struck him again. None of those children showed physical injuries, and yet eyewitnesses recalled how terrified they looked when they were rescued. Hayes's reports conveniently left those details out. Over and over. That was no coincidence. Clark made a vow. He would uncover everything Hayes tried to bury. He expanded the investigation even further, digging through every case file Hayes had ever touched. Every child found by Hayes shared the same pattern. No bruises, no wounds, but deep-rooted fear. Clark knew this wasn't luck or protocol. It was manipulation, and Hayes was at the center of it. Soon, more victims began coming forward, now grown, once voiceless. Their stories were hesitant at first, fragile, but every testimony painted a similar picture. Hayes wasn't a hero. He was a threat, a man who found them too easily, stayed too calm, asked too few questions. Most haunting of all, the gaps in his reports. Pages of missing truth, crafted to hide pain. Clark began connecting the dots. This wasn't random. It was a pattern, a system. Hayes had been covering up not only his own crimes, but possibly the crimes of others. Clark could see it now, a tangled network of silence and complicity, and right at the heart of that silence was Max. Max, who had guarded Sophie with his life, who stood as a voiceless witness to everything Hayes had done. He wasn't just a companion. He was the last thread of truth no one could erase. But Clark's mind kept returning to Sophie. The little girl who now stood in the center of the storm, no longer just a victim, but the one person brave enough to face Hayes head-on in court. The trial continued. The courtroom was packed. Tension crackled in the air. Sophie sat beside her mother, still clutching her stuffed bunny. But her face, calm, determined, never looked away from Hayes. She knew her voice mattered now, that what she said could change everything. Hayes, usually composed, began to slip. He tried to hide it, but those in the courtroom could see it, the stiffness, the nervous eyes, the shallow breath. Then Sophie stood. She faced Hayes directly, no hesitation, pointed and said again, clear, strong, unwavering, "He's the bad man." Her words echoed. The silence was absolute. No one dared move, not even breathe. Sophie's innocence made the truth heavier. Even the lawyers fell quiet. Hayes's mask shattered. He stared at her, blank, stunned, then slowly turned toward Clark, as if seeking help. But Clark offered nothing. It was too late. Sophie continued, steady as ever. It wasn't anyone else. He's the one who locked me in the storage room. The room turned to stone. Those few words crushed the atmosphere. People shifted uncomfortably. Prosecutors exchanged looks. Even Hayes's lawyers went pale. Clark watched from behind. He could feel it, the weight of the moment, the shift in the tide. Sophie's confrontation wasn't just emotional, it was decisive. Hayes had nowhere left to run. Max nearby stood quietly. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He didn't need to. His eyes never left Sophie, alert, gentle, protective. There was something sacred about that silent bond between them. No one could break it. Hayes, cornered now, sat frozen in his chair. Every lie he'd ever told, every child he'd ever hurt, every report he'd ever forged. It was all unraveling. People in the courtroom began murmuring, hushed but rapid. Even the defense attorneys looked shaken. The judge raised her eyes, hard and cutting. "Officer Hayes," she said, voice clear and cold. "Do you have anything to say?" He didn't. He couldn't. And Clark knew. The truth was finally surfacing. Because of a girl who refused to be silenced. And a dog who never left her side. With Sophie and Hayes now face to face, this was no longer just a battle between a child and a corrupt officer. It had become a psychological war. One where Sophie, armed with nothing but her courage, forced Hayes to confront a truth he could no longer hide from. What she exposed wasn't just what happened to her. She had unlocked a door that couldn't be shut again. Not for Hayes, and not for anyone else who had ever used their power to do harm. When Sophie pointed at Hayes, her words weren't just testimony. They became a moment of irreversible truth. But that moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. Standing beside her was Max, Sophie's silent guardian. And this time, the dog could no longer stay quiet. Something in Sophie's voice, the clarity in her accusation, triggered an instinct in Max. A warning, a threat still loomed near Sophie, and Max felt it deep in his bones. Then Hayes stepped forward. Max moved. Though trained as a calm, controlled canine unit dog, Max couldn't suppress his emotions this time. As Hayes drew closer, Max's body tensed like a bowstring pulled tight. His eyes locked onto Hayes. His hackles rose. A low, rumbling growl emerged from his throat, a deep, primal sound that made every person in the courtroom go still. Hayes froze. His calm was gone. He stared at Max with something close to fear, not of a dog, but of a reckoning. Max was no longer just a police dog. He had become something more powerful, a silent witness, a living embodiment of a truth Hayes had spent years trying to bury. From across the room, Clark felt it too. The air shifted. The threat was no longer hidden. It was standing in plain sight, in the form of a loyal animal trembling with fury. Max was no longer just protecting Sophie physically. He was exposing Hayes with every breath. When Hayes stepped closer again, Max snapped. In a flash, he lunged, not to attack, but to intercept, a living wall between Sophie and danger. His growl deepened, a sharp snarl cutting through the tension like a blade. The entire courtroom gasped. Every movement stopped. All eyes on Max, the one creature who made no speeches but whose message was unmistakable. He wasn't afraid. He wouldn't let Hayes come any closer. And in Max's eyes, there was only one person he trusted. One soul worth protecting. Sophie? The scene sent chills through the room. This wasn't just a dog reacting. This was a protector making a statement. Max's body language screamed one truth. The lies end here. Hayes stood frozen. This dog, the same one he had once trained, used, possibly abused, now stood against him. And Max wasn't just standing still. He was ready. Clark watched from across the courtroom, a cold wave running down his spine. He looked at Max, then at Sophie. In that moment, the connection between them, girl and dog, became undeniable. They weren't just survivors. They were the truth. Max had been there. He had seen things no one else had. His reactions weren't instinct. They were memory, and they were damning. Everyone in the courtroom could see it now. Max's tension around Hayes wasn't random. It wasn't a behavioral glitch. It was a response to trauma, to danger, to evil. And no matter how silent Max remained, his body told the story that words couldn't. Sophie, in that moment, was no longer a frightened child. She was the voice Hayes couldn't silence. She stood tall in her own way, eyes sharp with resolve, and repeated once more, "The bad man. It's him. It was always him." Her voice shook no one, except Hayes. The truth wasn't imaginative fantasy. It was a reality none of them could unsee. Judge Mathers watched it all unfold, her gaze darting from Max to Hayes, her brow furrowed. Doubt turned to suspicion. She looked to Clark, then back at Hayes, who now stood paralyzed, as if Max's stance had pinned him in place. This was no longer just a testimony. It was a turning point. And Hayes had run out of places to hide. Right after the trial, Clark couldn't sit still. He knew he had to act, and fast. Hayes' carefully constructed web of manipulation was starting to unravel. The evidence so far, Sophie's testimony, Max's reactions, had cracked open the silence Hayes had hidden behind for years. But it wasn't enough. Clark needed more. Something that would expose the full extent of Hayes' crimes. A few days later, while combing through old case files, Clark received a call from his investigative team. Urgent. They had discovered old surveillance footage from a storage facility, the very one where Sophie had been held. The video was a breakthrough. It showed Hayes and Max at the site during the exact time Sophie had gone missing. Clark's heart sank as he watched the footage. There was Hayes standing near a vehicle, and Max pacing nearby. Hayes didn't look like a man trying to save a child. There was no panic, no urgency. His demeanor was calm. Too calm. The footage told a different story, one that Clark could no longer ignore. Hayes hadn't stumbled upon Sophie by accident. He had known. Clark immediately called an emergency meeting with the investigative team. What they had just uncovered was a turning point. The video placed Hayes at the scene, not as a rescuer, but potentially as the perpetrator. It wasn't conclusive, but it tightened the noose. Clark knew they needed more footage, more leads, anything to complete the picture. And the picture was getting clearer. The missing child cases Hayes had been involved in began connecting like pieces of a hidden mosaic. Each time, the children were found unhurt, physically, but every witness remembered the fear in their eyes. And every time, Hayes had written the reports, clean, polished, deceitful. This was no coincidence. Clark saw the pattern now. Hayes had used his badge to cover his tracks. He wasn't a lone offender. He was part of something larger, an organized system, a machine of silence. From falsified documents to manipulated rescues, Hayes had weaponized his authority to protect something dark. Through it all, Max remained steady, not just as a witness, but as a guiding force. Clark had watched the dog closely. Every time Hayes came near Sophie, Max would tense. Every time Sophie trembled, Max stood taller. These weren't random behaviors. They were warnings, messages, proof. Max had seen what no one else could, and Clark finally understood. It was Max's protection that had opened the path to the truth. Now, with undeniable evidence and Max's unwavering presence, Clark had no doubts left. Hayes wouldn't walk free, Not this time. The crimes he'd hidden were coming to light, and Max, loyal and silent, was the witness who could not be silenced. The next day, the courtroom filled once again, tension at its peak. Sophie, no longer the frightened child, stood tall beside Lena. Her eyes never left Hayes. She had grown stronger, and everything she said now rang with clarity and truth. Across the room, Hayes sat motionless. The cold stare he wore so often couldn't mask what was happening now. He was surrounded by evidence, by testimony, by the past. The trial resumed, and the pressure escalated. Hayes's defense attorney stood and tried to deflect. "This child's words cannot be considered reliable," he argued, voice sharp. "She was only 3 years old at the time. Memory at that age is too fragile to serve as legal proof." But what he didn't count on was the strength in Sophie's eyes. She didn't flinch. Under pressure, she stood her ground and declared, again, that Hayes was the one who hurt her, that he had hurt others too. Clark watched from the sidelines. But he wasn't just an investigator anymore. He was now a witness to justice rising. The prosecutor, Michael Green, stood and began laying out the evidence, clear, irrefutable. Hayes had inserted himself into every case. Always the first to find the children, always filing the reports, always making sure nothing seemed out of place. But now, it was all unraveling. "And most importantly," Green said, turning to face the judge and jury, "this evidence here?" He pointed to Max, standing calmly beside Clark. "This dog is not ordinary. His behavior speaks louder than words. Every time Hayes approached, Max reacted. Not out of confusion, but recognition, out of memory, out of fear." Green stepped closer. "Max is a living witness, a silent but powerful presence. He stood by Sophie not just as a guardian, but as the one who knew the truth, long before we did. And every movement he's made in this courtroom has told us what we need to know." Clark stood tall, Max by his side. And in that moment, Max was no longer just a dog. He was the last link, the final piece, the living proof that Hayes could no longer hide. The atmosphere in the courtroom had grown razor sharp. Hayes had nowhere left to hide. He could deny the charges all he wanted, but with each new piece of evidence, he was being cornered. Sophie and Max had stood their ground, not just in defense of justice, but as living proof that no one could outrun the truth. Clark could feel it now. The end was within reach. Sophie's testimony, Max's protection, the unraveling lies, all the pieces were falling into place. But just as everything seemed to be aligning, something unexpected happened. The trial resumed after a short recess. That's when a man appeared, a figure no one recognized, but one with a clear connection to Hayes. He had been watching silently, waiting. Now, with sinister purpose, he stepped into the courtroom. No one expected it, least of all Sophie, who had no idea a new threat was creeping toward her. Sitting quietly beside her mother, Sophie didn't sense the danger. Her wide eyes still held flickers of fear, but they also burned with quiet resolve. What she didn't know was that behind her, the man was moving. Quick, intentional. Closing the distance. No one noticed in time. No one except Max. The canine, who had been allowed to rest near Clark's side, suddenly stirred. His body tensed. He sensed something. Something wrong. Something dark. Without a sound, Max launched forward. There was no bark, no growl, just a blur of muscle and purpose as the dog tore across the room, moving with terrifying speed toward Sophie. In a flash, Max hurled himself between the girl and the stranger, his powerful frame slamming into the man just seconds before he could reach her. From across the courtroom, Clark saw it unfold like a slow-motion nightmare. He didn't have time to process it. Max had already acted. The stranger flew backward and hit the ground hard. Gasps echoed through the room. Judges, attorneys, witnesses, all frozen in shock. Max stood firm, body low and eyes sharp, shielding Sophie like a wall of instinct. The attacker lay stunned on the floor. Bailiffs rushed in and restrained him within seconds. The threat was neutralized, but the shock remained. And in the middle of it all, Sophie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at Max with wide, clear eyes and gratitude that needed no words. Max had done it again. Not just a guard dog, not just a loyal companion, but a hero. Clark rushed forward, heart pounding. He stared down at the man being cuffed. This wasn't a random incident. It was a calculated attempt to silence Sophie and Max, to stop them from bringing the full truth into the light. Clark knelt beside Sophie, who now clutched Max tightly. The dog stood strong, silent, still watching the fallen man with unflinching eyes. Clark realized something. Sophie had already faced Hayes, but now she had faced something even darker, and she was still standing, because Max had never left her side. Everything had changed in that moment. Max was no longer just a police dog. He was Sophie's protector, her shield, the one who leapt into danger when no one else saw it coming. And his courage had shifted the entire course of justice. Judge Mathers slowly stood, her face solemn. "I want to thank this dog," she said, voice steady, reverent. "He just saved this child's life." The courtroom rose to their feet in unison. It wasn't just protocol. It was gratitude, respect. Emotion swelled in every chest. Max had become more than a symbol. He was living proof of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Clark looked at Max, emotions swelling in his chest. This dog had done more than any witness ever could. From Sophie's testimony to Max's instincts, the truth was no longer hidden. Hayes's network, his crimes, his deception, all of it had been dragged into the light. And Max had not only saved a little girl. He had brought down a hidden world of darkness. He was more than a hero. He was the bridge to justice, the soul that carried truth without ever needing to speak. The day of sentencing had arrived. Hayes sat silently in the courtroom, the defiance in his eyes long gone. Every piece of evidence had been laid out. There was nothing left for him to argue, nothing left to twist. From the back of the courtroom, Clark watched, eyes steady, heart resolute. He had followed the truth to the very edge. And now, Hayes would finally face it. Judge Mathers rose from the bench, her face grave, the embodiment of true justice. Her gaze bore down on Hayes, sharp and unflinching. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice commanding the silence in the room. "You abused your power, not just against innocent children, but also against the animals entrusted to you for protection. Your actions are inexcusable." She paused, letting her words echo through the charged stillness. "With the overwhelming evidence presented, and the irrefutable testimony of your victims, I now render judgment. You are found guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority in the line of duty. You are hereby sentenced to 40 years in prison, without parole." The courtroom broke into a collective breath, half relief, half sorrow. This was justice. Hayes bowed his head, silent, defeated. In his eyes, helplessness. He understood now. This was the fate he could no longer escape. Clark didn't smile, but inside, a weight began to lift. Justice had been served. Sophie sat quietly beside Lena, her gaze never drifting toward Hayes. She remained composed, her small face glowing with strength and pride. She had done more than tell the truth. She had restored justice, not just for herself, but for every child Hayes had harmed. And beside her, Max sat, head low, posture calm, as if he understood his job was done. His protection wasn't only of the body, it was of the soul. And in that, Max had helped Sophie heal in ways no one else could. Clark looked at Max with a heart full of gratitude. This dog wasn't just an animal. He was a true friend, a silent witness. Max had done what no person could, led them to the truth, and guarded it fiercely. Clark knew now, without doubt, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes quietly, through loyalty, through love. After the verdict, it wasn't only Hayes who had to face consequences. It was the system, too. Clark didn't stop there. He began working with animal rights organizations, determined to make sure cases like this would never happen again. Sophie and Max had become symbols of justice, proof that love and loyalty could prevail, even against darkness. The case of Hayes was no longer just a criminal investigation. It was a wake-up call. From it, the Sophie Max Initiative was born, a movement to protect the voiceless, both children and animals, from those who misuse power. Reform began to spread through police departments. Clark stood outside a packed conference hall, organized by advocacy groups and police reform leaders. For the first time, he saw real momentum. Lawmakers, animal welfare experts, community leaders, all gathered to support the Sophie Max Initiative. Its mission was clear: overhaul the way canine units are monitored and treated. Ensure no dog was ever again a tool of abuse, but instead a partner, respected and protected. Workshops and forums were held. Clark and his allies spoke about the hidden dangers they had faced during the Hayes case. They called for independent oversight boards, regular mental health screenings for canine officers, and humane training practices. These weren't just changes for dogs. They were safeguards for justice. Sophie and Max were invited to a special ceremony. There, under soft lights and surrounded by hundreds of people, they were honored. Sophie, small, brave, and bright-eyed, stood tall beside Max, now a national symbol of unconditional love. Though still a child, her story had touched thousands. And Max? Max was no longer just a canine. He was a hero. Their bond had changed how people saw justice, not just as laws and rulings, but as compassion, as protection, as standing up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The Sophie Max Initiative was soon implemented across major cities. Harsh training methods were banned, regular evaluations were instituted, and reforms began reshaping more than canine units. They transformed entire departments. Perhaps most importantly, independent watchdog organizations were created. Bodies tasked with tracking cases of misconduct involving canine handlers and ensuring transparency in all investigations. They gave voice to animals, to children, to those silenced by fear for far too long. And through it all, Sophie and Max remained symbols of what was possible. They had shown the world the strength of friendship, the power of truth, and the quiet heroism that comes from simply standing beside someone when they need you most. After all the pain, the fear, the trials, Sophie began a new life, one without nightmares, one with laughter. Each morning, she woke to a world where Max was still by her side. One spring morning, sunlight spilled through her window. Sophie stood quietly, looking out at the garden. There, beneath a tree, lay Max, his golden fur glowing under the soft light. She smiled. She didn't need to speak. He was there, and in his presence, she felt peace. Because Max hadn't just rescued her from a place of fear, he had led her all the way home. Lena, Sophie's mother, could feel the change, too. The fear that once shadowed her daughter's eyes had lifted. In its place was something steadier, something earned, quiet resilience. Sophie had grown through pain, and beside her through it all was Max, the irreplaceable friend who never left her side. Their lives now were no longer defined by the weight of the past, but by a future blooming with hope and love. Whenever Sophie faced something difficult, she no longer felt alone. She knew, without doubt, Max would always be there, not just as her protector, but as the calming presence that steadied her heart. Every night, before bed, Sophie would wrap her arms around him, burying her face in his warm fur. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. It wasn't just gratitude, it was love, pure and wholehearted. A thank you not for one moment, but for every moment Max had carried her through the darkness and into the light. Max didn't need words. He simply looked back at her, his eyes warm, soft, and full of understanding. In that gaze was everything. He knew he had fulfilled his purpose. He had protected her body, but more than that, he had protected her spirit from the monsters in the world and from the ones left behind in memory. Each day they grew closer. Sophie no longer lived under the shadow of nightmares. She didn't need to, because Max was always there, not just as her guardian, but as her anchor, her reminder that no matter what she had faced, she had made it through, and that now, she was free. Together they built a new life. No fear, no pain, just laughter, healing, and the soft rhythm of pause following small footsteps into a brighter day. Sophie had learned something not all grown-ups understand, that real heroes don't always come with grand gestures or shining armor. Sometimes, heroes come in quiet forms, in loyalty, in gentle eyes, in the unspoken promise that someone will always be there. When she hugged Max, she felt it, a bond deeper than words. The past no longer held power over her. Because Max wasn't just a dog, he was the soul that stayed, the friend who never let go, the steady heartbeat in a world that had once felt broken. His love, his loyalty, had helped her overcome everything. And now, at last, they could live in peace. The story of Sophie and Max closes not with a dramatic ending, but with a truth so soft, so enduring, it doesn't need to shout, that real heroes aren't always the ones with the greatest strength. They are the ones who love, who protect, who stay, whether they're human or animal. Their story is a powerful testament to the loyalty and unconditional protection that can exist not just between people, but between people and the animals who choose to love them. Through this story, we are reminded that true strength often lives in sacrifice, in devotion, and in the kind of silent companionship that never wavers. Max, though just a dog, embodied all of it, courage, loyalty, and love that shielded a child from unthinkable pain and helped her rise again. He was never a tool. He was never just a working dog. He was a friend, a healer, a living example of what it means to stand between someone and the storm. Their story calls on us to remember our responsibility to animals, to protect those who cannot speak. Just as we fight for the vulnerable among us, so too must we stand for the creatures often overlooked or used. The message here is timeless, that love, loyalty, and mutual protection matter between all beings, across all boundaries, and sometimes the greatest heroes have 4 legs, a soft coat, and eyes that never look away. The story of Sophie and Max is more than a courtroom drama. It's a reminder of the quiet power of love, loyalty, and healing. At the heart of it stands a German shepherd, a breed known not only for its intelligence and strength, but for its unwavering devotion. Max wasn't just a canine. He was a guardian, a silent protector who stood between darkness and a child's fragile hope. His presence reminds us of the incredible bond that can exist between humans and animals, one built not on words, but on trust. This story calls us to protect and cherish those who cannot speak, innocent children and loyal animals. It encourages us to treat every dog, especially working breeds like the German Shepherd, not as tools, but as living souls capable of love, sacrifice, and courage. Let us build a world where animals are seen as companions, not commodities, where kindness outweighs cruelty and justice is shaped by compassion, because sometimes a wagging tail and a steady gaze are all it takes to change a life, or to save one. And in that we find our greatest strength, loving, protecting, and standing by those who need us most.